Rourke drove the pry bar into the brick with everything his shoulder had left. Mortar burst. The wall took the second hit and groaned. On the fourth, it folded inward like a chest giving up its last breath, and before he could get an arm out to stop it, 100 pounds of German Shepherd shoved past his knee harness plate, catching the light canine, and Jack stitched across it in white thread and drove his nose into the hole. Jack didn't bark. Jack never barked at money. He barked at what money was hiding. And 40 feet under that house, the tide had already started to climb. Assassin! If you believe some truths are worth digging up, no matter what it costs you, hit subscribe and stay with this story to the very end. It changes 3 times before it's over. And drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. 11 days before he swung that pry bar, Ethan Rourke stepped off the freight ferry at Harrow Bay with a canvas duffel over one shoulder and a dog walking a half step behind his right heel. And the first thing that happened to him in that town was that a man laughed at him. Not cruelly. That was the part Rourke would think about later. There was nothing cruel in it at all. It was the easy automatic laugh of a man who had already decided how a story was going to end and found it funny that somebody else hadn't caught up yet. Rourke was 45 years old. He wore a Navy working uniform, green digital camouflage, the pattern gone soft and pale at the shoulders and elbows from too many washes in too many years, because it was the most durable clothing he owned, and because owning it was cheaper than replacing it. His hair was dark brown, cut short, going gray at the temples in a way he had stopped noticing. He carried himself the way men carry themselves when their bodies were built for a job they no longer have, thick through the neck and forearms, heavy in the shoulders, moving with a kind of economy that looked almost like laziness, until you watched him step over a coil of dock line without breaking stride or looking down. He hadn't slept in a bed he owned in 4 years. He didn't tell people that. Jack came off the ramp behind him and stopped exactly where Rourke stopped, which was the only trick the dog had left that Rourke was still proud of. He was a big shepherd, tan, gold, and black, deep in the chest, with a tactical harness buckled across him, and a hip that had been rebuilt twice by men who were honest enough to tell him the second surgery hadn't taken. Jack didn't sniff the dock. He didn't pull. He stood with his weight forward and his ears up, and he read the men on the pier, the way Rourke had once read a doorway, and when he was finished, he sat down against Rourke's leg and waited. Nobody offered to help with the duffel. The man who laughed was named Marlin Pike, and he was the day foreman at the cannery, and he had a face that had spent 30 years outdoors and a coffee cup he held like a tool. He'd been watching Rourke since the ferry cleared the breakwater, and when Rourke came up the pier, he stepped into the middle of it, not aggressively, just enough that going around him would have meant something. "You're the Ashcroft one," Pike said. Rourke stopped. "I'm Rourke." That's what I said. Pike looked at the uniform, looked at the dog, looked at the duffel, which was old and soft and clearly held everything Rourke had. And that was when he laughed one short breath through the nose, and then a real one, and behind him 2 other men picked it up because that's how laughter works in a town of 900 people. "Mr. Pike said you didn't inherit a house. You inherited a lawsuit with a roof on it." Rourke didn't answer. He had learned somewhere between his second deployment and his last one that the fastest way to lose ground with a man like Pike was to defend yourself in the first 30 seconds. So he stood there and let it sit, and after a moment, Pike's grin slipped a little because a joke that doesn't land has to be explained, and explaining it makes you the one doing the work. "County condemned that place 4 years ago," Pike said more flatly now. "Storm took the east side clean off. Roof's open to the sky. There's a lien on it, there's a demolition file on it, and there's about $11,000 a year in back taxes on a lot nobody can build on because it's 40 feet from a cliff edge that's been sliding since before you were born." He shrugged. "Old man Ashcroft was the last person on God's earth who wanted it, and he's dead. So congratulations." "Appreciate the briefing," Rourke said and walked past him. The laugh came again behind his back, smaller, and it followed him up the hill. He'd been to Harrow Bay exactly once before in 2003 for 4 days as a 22-year-old who had just failed the second phase of BUDS and been given a choice by a master chief named Silas Ashcroft: quit clean or come north and work on his house for a week and think about it. Rourke had gone north. He'd carried lumber and pulled nails and eaten dinner across a table from a man who didn't say more than 9 words a day, And on the fourth night, Silas had told him the only piece of advice Rourke ever actually kept, which was that most men don't fail because they can't. They fail because somewhere in the middle they start negotiating with themselves about whether they should. Then Rourke went back and finished, and after that he was in for 19 years, and he saw Silas Ashcroft maybe 6 times in all of it, at a change of command, at a retirement, twice at funerals. And now there was a letter from a lawyer in his P.O. box in Klamath Falls saying the man had left him a house. He'd read it 3 times standing in that post office. He'd read it a 4th time in the truck with Jack's chin on his thigh. And what he had felt was not gratitude. What he had felt and could not explain to himself was a low, sick pull in the gut, the same one he used to get when a mission brief was too clean. Why me? Silas Ashcroft had a sister in Bend. He had 2 nephews. He had a navy full of men who'd have crossed a state line to carry his casket. Why a man he'd talked to 6 times in 20 years? The lawyer's office was above the hardware store, and the lawyer was a woman named Priscilla Nunn who was somewhere past 70 and had not softened with it. She looked at Jack and said the dog could come in, which was the first decent thing that had happened to Rourke that day, and then she opened a file and stopped being pleasant. Before I read this to you, I'm obligated to tell you 3 things, she said. 1, the property has an active demolition recommendation from the county building department. 2, there is a tax lien. 3, I advised Silas against this instrument twice, and he ignored me twice. So if you're about to ask me whether it's a good idea, it isn't, and I've already said so on the record. I wasn't going to ask. Everyone asks. She turned a page. The estate transfers to you free and clear of the lien. He paid that off in cash in December, which is another thing I told him not to do. The transfer is not immediate. There's a condition. Rourke waited. You must reside at the property continuously for 30 days. Nunn said. Continuously is defined here in his own language, and it's specific. You may not spend a night off the property. If you do, the estate passes to the county sells it to satisfy the demolition costs, and everything in it becomes municipal salvage. Rourke's hand had gone still on his knee. Jack lifted his head. 30 days, Rourke said. 30 days. He wrote that himself. Longhand watched him do it. Nunn set the paper down and looked at him over the top of her glasses, and there was something in her face then that hadn't been there a minute earlier. Mr. Rourke, I've drafted maybe 400 wills in this town. Residency clauses are for family disputes. A man puts one in when he's afraid a house is going to get emptied before the body's cold. Emptied by who? He didn't say. She pushed a second item across the desk. He gave me this 11 months ago and told me to hand it over only after you'd signed the acceptance. Not before. It was a legal envelope, thick-sealed twice, once with the flap glued down, and once with a strip of black electrical tape across it, which was a thing Rourke had seen done to waterproof gear bags and never to mail. On the front, in block capitals that hadn't changed in 20 years, if you open it, don't stop halfway. Rourke sat looking at that for longer than was comfortable for either of them. You know what's in it? He asked. No, and I made him confirm on tape that I didn't, which I have never done in my career, and I'd like you to think about why an old man would make his own attorney do that. Rourke signed the acceptance. He put the envelope in the duffel without opening it, and he would not open it for 18 more days, and every single thing that happened in between would make that decision worse. He met Sheriff Wallace Doty in the parking lot, which was not an accident. Doty was 58 and had the build of a man who used to be strong and had let it go on purpose. He was polite. That was the thing about him that Rourke would find hardest to hate later. He was never once rude. Heard you came in on the frayed, Doty said. Wanted to introduce myself before somebody else told you something wrong about me. Appreciate it. You planning to stay up there? That's the arrangement. Doty nodded slowly, looking off toward the water. I'm going to give you the same advice I'd give my own brother. Sell it. There's a management group out of Portland's been trying to buy that headland for 6 years. They'll pay you more than it's worth just to be done with it, and you can walk out of here with money in your pocket and no hard feelings from anybody. Why would there be hard feelings? It was a simple question. Rourke asked it without heat. But Doty's jaw moved once, a small adjustment, the kind a man makes when a question lands somewhere he wasn't defending. Small town, Doty said. People get attached to how things are. That's not an answer, Sheriff. No, Doty agreed, it isn't. And he touched the brim of his hat and got in his truck, and Rourke stood there in the lot with his dog and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he had just been warned by a man who did not have the nerve to say what he was warning him about. The house was worse than Pike had described it, and Pike had been trying to be funny. Rourke walked the whole structure before he brought the duffel in because that was habit, and habit had kept him alive. The east wing was gone, not damaged, gone the framing, snapped off at the second floor, and the rest of it collapsed down the slope years ago. The main body still stood. There was a county notice zip-tied to the front door in a plastic sleeve, faded to the point of illegibility, and Rourke cut it off with his knife and put it in his pocket instead of throwing it away, because you don't throw away papers somebody official put on a door. Inside it was cold, and it smelled like salt and old wood, and the particular sourness of a building that has been rained on from the inside. There was furniture, there were books on shelves, there was a coffee cup on a side table with an inch of black residue dried in the bottom of it. That was what got him. Not the ruin, the cup. Silas Ashcroft had died in a hospice bed in Coos Bay in February, but he had actually lived here in a condemned building with a hole in the roof for 4 years after the storm, and the cup on the table meant he had been sitting in this room drinking coffee like a man with nowhere else to be. He'd had money. He'd paid off an $11,000 lien in cash. He could have gone anywhere. He stayed in a house the county had already given up on. Rourke turned in a slow circle with that thought going through him like cold water. And then he heard Jack's nails stop. The dog was in the hallway, not at the far end, right at the mouth of it at the threshold where the main body of the house ran back toward the collapsed east side. Jack had his front feet planted, and his weight shifted back onto his hips, which he never did, which hurt him to do. I was not growling. His ears were forward, and his head was low, and his whole body had gone into the shape it used to make in Anbar in 2011 when there was something under a road. Jack, Rourke said. The dog didn't look at him. Rourke went down the hallway alone. There were 4 doors. 3 opened. The 4th was blocked, not locked, blocked, the door swollen shut in a frame that had racked out of square when the east side went. He put his shoulder against it twice and felt it move a 1/4 inch and stop. And behind it he could feel the pressure difference of a room with outside air in it. He came back. Jack had not moved from the threshold. Not 1 inch. Rourke crouched, put a hand flat on the dog's chest, and felt his heart going hard and steady under the ribs. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me too." He would sleep in the front room for 8 nights before he understood that Jack had been standing there for a reason that had nothing to do with the door. The town closed up around him fast, and it did it politely, which was worse. The hardware store had no plywood. Then it had plywood, but the delivery was Thursday. Then Thursday came and the delivery was Tuesday. The diner served him, but the second morning the counter seats on either side of him stayed empty, and the waitress stopped refilling without being asked. Nobody said a word to him about the house. Nobody asked him a single question about Silas Ashcroft, and in a town of 900 people, where a stranger had just inherited the biggest structure on the coastline, that was not indifference. That was discipline. Rourke had run into it before in villages where everybody knew which house the weapons were in, and everybody had the same story ready. On the 4th day, he was coming out of the market with a bag of screws and a case of water when a kid stepped in front of him. She was 10, maybe 11, with a backpack that was too big for her and a jacket that had been somebody else's first. She didn't look nervous. She looked like a person who had made a decision and was executing it. She looked at Jack's harness first, read the stitching. Then she looked up at Rourke. "Does your dog smell sickness?" she said. Rourke stopped. "Some dogs do," she said. "I read it. They can smell it before the machines can." Her hands had gone tight on the straps of the backpack. "My dad's sick. He's been sick for a long time, and everybody keeps saying it's not from what he thinks it's from. But I know it is, so I need to know if your dog can smell it." Rourke had been shot at by men who moved him less than that did. He crouched down because he was 1.5 feet taller than her, and that mattered. And Jack came around and sat and let her put her hand flat on his shoulder without so much as turning his head. "What's your dad's name?" Rourke asked. "Danny Kerrigan." "What's yours?" "Josie." "Josie," he nodded. "Jack can smell some kinds of sickness. Not all of them. He's not a doctor, and neither am I, so I'm not going to lie to you about that." He watched her take it. She didn't flinch. She just filed it. "Who told your dad it wasn't from what he thinks?" And Josie Kerrigan looked at him with the flat-tired patience of a child who has explained something to adults before and been handled instead of answered. Everyone, she said. Then she picked up her backpack and went, and a woman across the street who had been watching the whole thing turned and walked into a store. Rourke stood in that parking lot for a full minute with his hand still on his dog. Not from what he thinks it's from. You don't say that about the flu. You say that about exposure. That night, he did something he had not planned to do, which was go through the house properly. He started in the front room with a headlamp and worked outward, and what he found in the first 2 hours was a picture of a man he did not recognize. Silas Ashcroft, who in Rourke's memory had been about as sentimental as a Ballard, had kept everything. Not hoarding filing. There were banker's boxes stacked in the pantry with years written on them in marker. There was a footlocker of uniforms pressed in bags. There was a shoebox of photographs, and Rourke sat on the floor with it and went through the whole thing and found 4 pictures of himself in it at 22 carrying lumber on this property, which meant the old man had photographed a kid he barely knew and kept it for 23 years. That was when Rourke had to put the box down and sit with his forearms on his knees for a while. He had come here angry. He'd been carrying it since the post office, the anger of a man who has been handed something by someone who never called him, never wrote him, never once in 19 years said, "How are you holding up?" And now here were 4 photographs. Why me? The question had a different weight now. It had gotten heavier instead of lighter, which is how you know a question is the real one. Jack was in the doorway again. Same threshold, same posture. Rourke got up and went past him and put his light down the hall, and this time he looked at the walls instead of the doors, and that was when he saw the brick. The hallway ran to a dead end where the east wing had been. That end wall should have been open, framing, or sheathing, or a tarp, anything a man puts up in a hurry after a storm takes a wing off his house. It was brick, full height, corner to corner, dated in a proper running bond. Rourke stood in front of it for a long moment before he understood why his stomach had dropped. The mortar was clean. Every other surface in that house was 4 years into the weather. The framing was gray. The plaster had bloomed. But the mortar joints in that wall were sharp and pale and had grit, still standing proud in them. And when he put his thumbnail in one, it took real pressure to mark it. Nobody bricks up a hallway in a condemned house. Nobody does it recently. Rourke put his palm flat on it. Then he put his ear against it, and he held his breath, and he waited a full 30 seconds, and underneath the wind noise in the roof, he heard it a long, slow hollow, suck and release. Not wind. Wind doesn't have a rhythm. Water, moving, somewhere well below the level of the floor he was standing on. Jack came off the threshold for the first time in 4 days and pressed his whole body against Rourke's leg and stared at the brick, and the sound he made was so low that Rourke felt it through his boot before he heard it. "All right," Rourke said. "All right." He went and got the pry bar. The wall came down in 4 strikes, and the shepherd went through the hole before Rourke could get an arm out to stop him. Jack out, the dog backed out with dust all through his ruff and his nose working, and Rourke got the light in and swept it and felt every muscle in his back go tight at once. It wasn't a room, it was the top of a stair. Stone going down, turning left at 8 steps, disappearing. Cut into the rock the house sat on, and it was old, the treads worn concave in the middle, the way stone only wears from 100 years of feet. But the handrail bolted into the wall beside it was galvanized pipe, and the bolts were stainless, and they were not 100 years old. They were maybe 5. Silas Ashcroft, at 66 years old, with a hole in his roof and a county notice on his door, had put a handrail on a stairway nobody knew existed, and then bricked the top of it shut behind him. Rourke went down 4 steps and stopped because the air coming up was cold and moving and smelled like the ocean, and because at the turn of the stair his light hit something that was not stone. A navy dive locker, steel olive drab latch sitting on the 5th tread like a man had carried it up and gotten tired. Rourke got it up into the hallway before he opened it because you don't open a container in a confined space, and he was aware while he was doing it that he had automatically done 4 things in the correct order that he had not needed to do in 6 years. Inside were 3 items. The first was a dive log, green cover, government issue, Silas Ashcroft's name on it in his own hand. Rourke flipped it, and the entries ran clean and boring for 200 pages depths times gas mixes, sea states, and then in March of 2009 they stopped. Not tapered. Stopped. mid-page, and the next 12 pages had been cut out with a blade close to the spine so cleanly that Rourke had to run his thumb down the gutter to feel the stubs. The second was a photograph. 14 men on the deck of a salvage vessel in wetsuits pushed down to the waist, squinting into the sun, 2 rows. Ordinary, the kind of picture that exists 10,000 times over in 10,000 houses. Silas was in the back row, second from left, younger, unsmiling. On the back in pencil, someone had written a date and nothing else, 12, MR 2009. And someone else, different pressure, different pencil later, had gone through and put a small, careful X above 9 of the 14 faces. Rourke counted them twice, 9. He sat back on his heels with that photograph in both hands and felt the floor of his own chest give out a little. He had seen a picture like that before. Every man who ever served has. But you put the X's on after a deployment on a wall in a bar. You don't put 9 of them on a salvage crew. Salvage crews don't lose 9 men, not unless something happened to them afterward. Danny Kerrigan, he said out loud to nobody, and Jack's ears came up at the name because Rourke's voice had changed. He went back through the 5 faces without X's, one at a time, slow. Third from the right in the front row was a young guy, mid-20s, heavy through the shoulders, laughing at something out of frame. Rourke didn't know him, but he knew that jaw and that squint and the way the eyebrows sat because he had seen all of it 4 days ago in a parking lot on a 10-year-old girl with a backpack too big for her, asking whether a dog could smell what the doctors wouldn't. The third item in the locker was an envelope, and inside the envelope was a single certificate on heavy paper with a coupon sheet still attached along the perforation, and Rourke had to read it 3 times before it meant anything, because he had never in his life held one. A bearer bond, $50,000, issued 2009. Bearer bonds don't have a name on them. That's the whole point of them. Whoever holds the paper owns the money, no account, no signature, no record of transfer. They stopped issuing them in the United States in the 80s because they were the single cleanest instrument ever invented for moving money, without leaving a trail, and the ones that still moved after that came out of institutions that had specific reasons for wanting money to move that way. $50,000 sitting in a steel box in a stairwell, in a house with a hole in the roof that a man had bricked shut and then died in. Not spent, not cashed. The coupons were all still attached, every one of them going back 14 years. Silas Ashcroft had held $50,000 for 14 years and had not taken a single payment off it. You don't do that with money you stole. You do that with money you're keeping as evidence. Rourke sat down on the hallway floor with his back against the wall, which put him facing the open black mouth of that stairway, and he put the bond down on one knee and the photograph on the other. And he did the arithmetic he had been avoiding since the post office. A man leaves you a ruined house. He requires you in writing to sleep in it for 30 consecutive days. He pays off the line in cash so nobody can take it out from under you. He seals an envelope with tape and makes his own attorney swear on tape she never read it. He bricks up the only way down to whatever is underneath, and he leaves you a photograph of 14 men with 9 of them crossed out. That is not an inheritance. That is a handoff. That is what a man does when he can't finish something and knows he's running out of time. And Rourke had been on the receiving end of a handoff before, and every time in his life, it had meant that somebody was about to die or already had. Jack's head came up off the floor. He came up onto all 4 feet in one motion, and his hip failed him a little the way it always did on the first step, and he did not care. He went past Rourke down the hallway toward the front of the house with his nails hitting hard, and he stopped 6 feet inside the front door and stood there absolutely still with his weight forward. Rourke was up before he knew he'd decided to be. He killed the headlamp. 12 seconds later, he heard it, an engine on the access road running slow, coming up the grade in 2nd gear, the way you drive when you don't want to be heard and don't know that gravel gives you away anyway. It stopped short of the gate. The engine shut off. A door opened and did not slam. Rourke stood in the dark with a bearer bond in one hand and a photograph in the other, and did the only calculation available to him, which was that it was 11 at night, he was 3 miles from town on a headland with 1 road in, and every single person in Harrow Bay had spent 4 days being extremely polite to him. Footsteps on gravel, 1 man, unhurried. Then from the far side of the gate, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry and not 1 decibel more, Senior Chief Rourke. Nobody in that town knew his rate. It wasn't in the will. It wasn't in the county file. Rourke put the photograph inside his jacket flat against his chest and stepped out onto the porch where he could be seen, because a man who hides has already conceded something. The man at the gate did not come through it. He stood with his hands loose and visible, which was itself a message, and he was dressed like somebody who had gotten out of a car in a city that morning, coat clean, shoes, no gloves. 50, give or take. He had the stillness of a person who had never in his adult life been the one who was afraid. "My name is Curtis Vane," he said. "I represent a risk management group. I'd like 10 minutes, and I'd rather have them out here than have you find me on your property some other night." "It's 11 o'clock. "It is." Vane didn't apologize for it. "I flew into Portland at 6 and drove. I don't like doing that either." Jack had come out to the top of the steps and stopped there, and he had not made a sound, and Rourke noticed that Vane's eyes went to the dog and stayed a beat too long, not fear. "Assessment. The way you look at a piece of equipment you've been briefed on." "You've got the wrong house," Rourke said. "I've got the right house. I've had the right house for 6 years." Vane put one hand on the top rail of the gate, easy like a neighbor. "Let me save us both the first 20 minutes. You inherited this property under a residency instrument. You have 26 days left on it. You have no income, no vehicle here, and no local support, and by Friday you'll discover that nobody in Harrow Bay will sell you materials at any price. None of that is a threat. It's just Tuesday. My company is prepared to purchase the property at $2.4 million in cash this week and to indemnify you against the lien, the demolition order, and the taxes. $2.4 million for a condemned building on a sliding cliff that Marlon Pike had laughed at him for accepting. Rourke felt the number land in his chest, and he felt something else land right behind it, which was the sick, clean certainty of a mission brief that is too clean. "That's about 20 times what it's worth," and he said. "It's about what it's worth to us." "For a cliff. For a headland with deep water access and a permitting history," Vane said smoothly. "You'd be amazed what's expensive." And then he did the thing that Rourke would go over in his head every night for the next 3 weeks. He looked past Rourke down the length of the hallway through the open front door at the pile of broken brick on the floor and the black mouth of the stair behind it. His expression did not change at all, but his weight came off the gate rail. "You opened the wall," Vane said. The wind moved in the roof. "You want to tell me how you'd know what's in my house," Rourke said. "Or you want to skip that and tell me who sent you?" Vane took his hand off the gate. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the salesman in it, and what was underneath was worse because it was patient. "Senior Chief, I'm going to say a phrase, and I want you to notice what your body does. Operation Nightglass." Rourke waited for the recognition to come. It didn't come. He turned it over. 2009, Salvage Monday now. Maybe he'd been in the Gulf that spring, and there was nothing. No brief, no chatter, no name on a whiteboard. 19 years, and he had never once heard it. "I don't know it," he said. "No," Vane agreed. "I didn't think you did." He reached slowly into his coat, took out a folded sheet of paper, and held it up so the porch light caught it. A photocopy of personnel roster, 15 numbered lines, most of it blacked out. "That's the dive roster for the 12th of March, 2009, Vane said. 14 men went into the water. The document lists 15. He let it hang there. "Line 15 is you, your name, your rate, your service number. Assigned it and then struck through by hand by the Master Chief who left you this house." He folded the paper again and put it back in his coat. "So before you decide you're the man who found something," Vane said, "I'd think very carefully about why you're the only one on that list still walking around, and why the old man made damn sure you were the one standing in that hallway tonight." He turned and walked back down the grade toward his car, unhurried, and did not look over his shoulder once. Rourke stayed on the porch until the taillights were gone off the headland and the sound of the engine had thinned out into nothing, and then he went inside and put his back against the wall and slid down it, and he got the photograph out of his jacket and held it under the headlamp, with both hands shaking hard enough that he had to brace his wrists on his knees. 14 faces, 9 X's. And somewhere in a file cabinet in Portland, a 15th line with his name on it crossed out in pencil by a man who never told him, never called him, never wrote him, and then left him the house, the stair, and 30 days. Jack came and lay down against his leg with his whole weight the way he did in the bad hours, and neither of them slept. By 6 in the morning, he had made 3 decisions, and the first one was that he was not going to open the sealed envelope yet. He told himself it was tactical. You don't take the last card off the table before you know what game you're in. But sitting there with his back against the wall and the dog's weight against his leg, Rourke was honest enough to name the real reason. And the real reason was that Curtis Vane had said the old man made damn sure you were the one standing in that hallway tonight, and Rourke was not ready to find out what a dead man had wanted from him. The second decision was that he was not going to go back down that stair until he understood what was at the bottom of it. And the third was that he needed a name because Vane had handed him one for free, and men like Vane don't hand you anything for free unless they've already decided it can't hurt them. Night class. He walked into town at 7. The library didn't open until 10, and the librarian took one look at the uniform and told him the public terminals were down for maintenance, and Rourke thanked her and stood outside on the step and understood that the terminals were fine. The Harrow Bay Ledger office was 2 doors down. 2 rooms, 1 window, a hand-lettered sign that hadn't been repainted in a decade. He'd walked past it 4 times and never gone in. The woman inside was in her 60s, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and she looked up at him and her whole face changed before he'd said a word. "You're Ashcroft's," she said. "Rourke." "Marguerite Teague." "Margot." She did not offer her hand. She got up and went to the door and turned the deadbolt and flipped the sign at 7 in the morning in a town where nothing was ever locked, and then she came back and sat down and put both palms flat on the desk like she was steadying it. "What do you want?" she said. "Meridian Vale." Margot Teague closed her eyes. She sat like that for 4 or 5 seconds. When she opened them, she wasn't looking at him. 14 years, she said. 14 years, and you're the third person to say those 2 words in this office, and the other 2 are dead. Jack lay down between the desk and the door without being told. "I need to know what it is," Rourke said. "You need to know what it was." She got up again and she went to a file cabinet at the back, not the one by the desk, the one under the window with a coat draped over it, and she moved the coat and pulled the bottom drawer, and it was full. Not files, newspapers folded, clippings and envelopes, a cardboard box with the flaps interlocked. "Salvage contract," she said. "March 2009. A freighter went down in the Sulu Sea in about 220 feet of water. The company that owned the cargo was a contractor called Ardent Maritime Group. Navy divers were tasked to recover what was in the hold." She set the box on the desk. "They were told it was electronics, guidance components, something sensitive enough that it justified sending men that deep for 9 days straight." "What was it?" "Industrial chemistry," Margot said. "Improperly declared, drummed, and the drums were compromised, and nobody topside knew that, or nobody topside said it. 14 men worked in a hold full of it for 9 days in wetsuits and standard rigs, and then they came up and everybody went home, and that was the end of it." Rourke didn't move. 9 days, he said. 9 days. She opened the box. 2 years later, a diver in Norfolk gets a diagnosis at 31 years old that doctors write papers about. Then another one in San Diego, then another. By 2014, there were 5, and the 5 of them found each other, and they filed, and the Navy came back with a determination that said their conditions were not service-connected. She took out a sheet of paper and slid it across. "That's the language. Read the second paragraph." Rourke read it. It was 2 sentences long, and it said in effect that no documented exposure event existed in the claimant's service record, and that in the absence of a documented exposure event, causation could not be established. "No documented event," Rourke said. "None anywhere." Margot's voice had gone flat and hard. "There's no incident report. There's no hazard log. There's no medical surveillance from the vessel. 14 men were in the water for 9 days, and the paper says nothing happened. And you cannot fight a determination like that, Mr. Rourke, because you're not arguing about the facts. You're arguing about whether there are any." Put a list on the desk. Handwritten in blue pen, names down the left and dates down the right, and some of the dates were in a different pen than the others, which meant she had added them one at a time over years. Rourke counted 9. He got the photograph out of his jacket and laid it beside the list and turned it over so she could see the 9 small pencil X's, and Margot Teague made a sound he would remember for a long time. Not a sob, just a short intake, the sound of a person seeing a thing they had believed alone confirmed by a stranger. "He was counting too," she whispered. "You knew him." "I've known Silas Ashcroft since 1908. She sat down hard. And for 14 years, that man has come into this office once a month, bought a copy of a paper he could have gotten free, and never said one word to me about any of this. Not one. She pressed the heel of her hand under her eye. And I never asked. So don't look at me like I'm the one who was brave. Rourke let that sit because he'd learned that when someone confesses something unprompted, the worst thing you can do is comfort them out of it. Why didn't you print it? He said. Because I have 41 column inches of advertising a week, Margot said, and 32 of them come from a company that has been owned since 2011 by Ardent Maritime Group. And I have told myself for 14 years that a paper that doesn't exist can't tell anybody anything. She looked up at him. That's the sentence. That's what I say to myself. You want it, you can have it. It works. There was one more thing in the box, and she took it out last and held it a moment before she gave it to him. 5 of them are still alive, she said. One's in Michigan, one's in a facility in Salem and doesn't know anybody. 2 won't talk to anyone, and I mean anyone I've tried for a decade. She handed him a slip of paper with an address on it. The 5th one lives 11 minutes from this desk. Rourke didn't need to read it. Danny Kerrigan, he said to him. Kerrigan's trailer sat at the end of a gravel spur past the cannery, and Rourke heard the concentrator before he was out of the truck. He'd borrowed off Nunn's clerk for $20 a compressor, cycling on-off, the sound going right through the metal wall. The door opened before he knocked. The man in it had been the guy in the front row of that photograph third, from the right, thick through the shoulders, laughing at something out of frame. He was 44 years old. He had lost so much weight that the skin of his throat hung loose, and there was a cannula under his nose and a line running back into the dark, and he held onto the door frame with one hand the way a man holds a rail on a boat. He looked at Rourke's uniform. He looked at Jack. And his face went through something complicated and fast, and what came out the other side was rage. No, Danny Kerrigan said. Mr. Kerrigan. No. He got a breath. You're the one up at Ashcroft's. My daughter came home and told me a man with a Navy dog said her dad might be right. Do you have any idea what you did? Rourke stood still. She's 10, Kerrigan said, and his voice cracked open on it. She's 10 years old and she's stopped crying about it. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She stopped. That took 2 years and you gave it back to her in a parking lot in 90 seconds. I told her I wasn't a doctor. You told her a dog could smell it. Kerrigan's knuckles were white on the frame. That's not nothing to a kid. That's not nothing. You're right, Rourke said. I'm sorry. And that stopped him because Kerrigan had braced for an argument and gotten an apology instead, and he stood there breathing with the machine cycling behind him and his eyes going wet. Go home, he said quieter. I can't. 9 of the 14 are dead. I know how many are dead. I can name them in order. Kerrigan wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. Go home, Senior Chief. Then answer one question and I'll walk. I'm not answering. Did Silas Ashcroft ever come here? Danny Kerrigan stopped. Something moved behind his face. It wasn't grief. Rourke had seen enough grief that year to know it on sight. And this was something further down, something with shame mixed into it, and it made the man look away. Get off my property, he said. He did. Get off my property. The door shut. The bolt went over. The concentrator kept cycling. Rourke stood there long enough to be sure the man wasn't coming back out, and then he walked back down the gravel, and he was almost to the truck when he heard the running. Josie Kerrigan came around the corner of the trailer flat out with the backpack slamming against her spine, and she didn't stop until she was close enough to grab his sleeve, and she was breathing so hard she couldn't get the first word out. He said, she got out. He said, you're the guy from up on the hill. Josie. He threw it away. She had the backpack off and open, and her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't work the zipper, and she wrenched it. 2 years ago, he put it in the burn barrel out back, and I took it out, and it's got a black mark on the corner that's from the barrel. I got it out before it caught. She pulled out a spiral notebook, warped the cover, half gone, a scorch across one corner. He doesn't know I have it. You can't tell him. Rourke crouched down. What is it? It's the letters. She pushed it into his hands. Every time they said no, they sent a letter, and Dad kept them all in here. And there's the doctor stuff too, the numbers from the tests. Her chin was going. He said keeping it was making him crazy. He said he had to stop. But you can't just stop, right? You can't just... She ran out of words. Rourke had held a lot of things in his life. He had never held anything that weighed what that notebook weighed. "You did the right thing," he said. "I don't care if it's right." Her voice went up and cracked. "I want somebody to read it. I'm going to read every page." She looked at him hard, checking it the way kids do when adults have lied to them before. And then she nodded once and picked up her bag and went, and she didn't run this time. He read it that night with a headlamp, sitting on the floor with his back to the same wall, and it took him 4 hours because he kept having to stop. 3 denial letters stapled at the corner. He read them straight through the first time and got the shape of it. He read them the second time and started to see it. He read them a third time with a pencil. Different letterhead on each one, different case number, different claimant, different city. Kerrigan's was Portland, one was Norfolk, one was San Diego. Different signatures. Same second paragraph. Not similar, not the standard language a reviewer copies out of a manual. Word for word, comma for comma, including a construction in the third sentence that no two people would ever independently produce in the absence of a documented exposure event contemporaneous to the period of service alleged. Rourke wrote it out 3 times, once from each letter, and lined them up, and they were identical to the letter. Then he checked the dates on the bottom. All 3 were dated the 22nd of September 2014. 3 claims, 3 regions, 3 offices 2,000 miles apart, denied on the same day in the same words. Rourke sat there with the pencil in his hand and felt something go cold and level in him the way it used to before a door. That wasn't a system failing. That was one person at one desk with one paragraph working through a stack. Somebody had gathered the claims and answered them together. Somebody had known there was a stack. Jack lifted his head off the floor, and Rourke reached over and put a hand on his neck without looking. And outside, the wind came up off the water and moved through the open roof of the east side, and Rourke thought, and if you know there's a stack, you know why there's a stack. Friday, the town stopped being polite. It started with the truck. He came out of the market and the rear tires were down, not cut, which would have been a crime he could report. Just the valve cores backed out with a tool, which is what a person does when they want you to understand it was deliberate and want no paper to exist about it. He aired them at the marina and said nothing to anybody. The hardware store had his order. It had been paid for. The kid behind the counter couldn't meet his eyes and said the order had been canceled by the supplier. And Rourke said, "Which supplier?" And the kid said he'd have to ask, and went in the back and didn't come out again. The diner locked the door at 2 in the afternoon on a Friday. And on the way back through town, he passed the elementary school and he stopped because there was a new gymnasium on the end of the building. New metal, new paint, the only new construction in Harrow Bay. And there was a brass plate mounted beside the doors, and it had a name on it. Ardent Maritime Group, Community Partner 2016. Rourke stood on that sidewalk for a while. 900 people, 1 cannery, 1 gym, 1 newspaper with 32 column inches of advertising a week. I wasn't fighting a conspiracy. There wasn't a room somewhere with everybody in it. That was the thing he was beginning to understand. Standing there, it had been broken into pieces so small that no single person had to carry more than they could live with. A signature here, a phone call not made, a newspaper not printed, a gym floor for the kids. You could hold your piece up in the light and say, honestly, this is nothing. 9 men were dead, and every one of them had been killed by 100 people doing nothing. Sheriff Doty came up the headland at dusk, and he didn't get out of the truck for a minute, which told Rourke he'd rehearsed something. "You had a flat," Doty said through the window. 2. "You want a file on it?" "No." Doty nodded like that was the answer he'd wanted, and also like it disappointed him. He got out then and leaned on the door. "Marlon Pike's got a brother," he said. He's on that list you've been carrying around town." He said it plainly. "Whole town knows what you're doing, son. There's 900 people here, and about half of them are related to somebody who worked that contract or works for that company now. Then help me. Help you do what? Say one true thing out loud in public." And Doty laughed, not the way Pike had on the pier. This was worse. This was a man laughing at himself. "You know what happens when I do that?" He turned around and put both hands on the truck bed and looked out at the water. "The cannery is a subsidiary, has been since 2011. 211 jobs in a town of 900. You go after that company, they don't fight you here, they just close the line and move it to Astoria, and it takes 90 days, and then there's no town." He shook his head. So tell me, you want me to choose between 900 people who are alive and 14 men who mostly aren't? That's not the choice. It's the only one anybody ever offers me. Sheriff, Rourke waited until the man turned around. 9 of them are dead and the paperwork says nothing happened to any of them. If nothing happened to them, then nothing happened to your 211 either whenever it's their turn. That's what the paragraph is for. Doty stood there. Then he got in his truck. Lock your door at night, he said, and drove off the headland. So they came in Sunday at 2:40 in the morning, and Rourke knew about it 11 seconds early because of the dog. Jack didn't bark. He came up off the floor and crossed the room and put himself between Rourke and the hallway and made that sound below hearing. And Rourke was on his feet with his boots already on because he had slept in them every night since the gate. 2 of them. He counted the footfalls. They came in through the collapsed east side, which meant they'd been up here before in daylight, and knew the approach, and they moved well. Not great, not tier 1, but trained and unhurried, the way private security moves when they've been told the building is empty. Rourke put his hand flat on Jack's chest and held him and did not move. They went straight down the hallway to the broken brick. He heard one of them stop at the pile and say something too low to catch, and then the other one, and then a phone screen, lit the hall for half a second and went out. They were photographing it, not taking, counting, photographing the hole, the debris, the top of the stair, establishing how far he'd gotten. Rourke's whole body wanted to move. 19 years of instinct, 2 men in his house, an open hallway, and a dark room, and every advantage on his side. And he made himself stand there with his hand on his dog and let it happen because he had exactly one thing going for him in this. And it was that Curtis Vane did not know what he'd found in the locker. They were up there 4 minutes. Then they went out the way they came. Rourke waited 8 more minutes before he let Jack go, and then he went down the hall with the light and looked at what they'd looked at, and that was when he saw it. They'd moved the pile, not much, but the brick he had thrown left had been stacked roughly into the corner, and the top 3 steps of the stair which he had left dusted with mortar grit had been swept clean by a boot. They hadn't gone down. They had stood at the top of that stair with the way open in front of them in an empty house at 2 in the morning, and they had not gone down. Rourke crouched there with his light on those clean steps and felt the hair come up on his arms. 2 men who could have walked down and taken whatever was at the bottom. 2 men who had been told specifically not to, which meant whatever was down there was not something Curtis Vane wanted moved. It was something he wanted in place. Stop. I didn't sleep. At 4 in the morning, he got the sealed envelope out of the duffel and put it on the floor in front of him and sat looking at it. If you open it, don't stop halfway. He thought about the 4 photographs of a 22-year-old kid carrying lumber. He thought about a man who paid off an $11,000 lien in cash and then died in a house with a hole in the roof. He thought about line 15 struck through in pencil. Why me? He'd been carrying that question for 11 days like a stone in his boot, and every answer he'd built for it had been a good one. Silas trusted him. Silas had nobody else. Silas wanted a man who wouldn't quit. They were all good answers, and Rourke had known since the gate that they were wrong because good men who trust you call you. 19 years, 6 conversations, and then a house. He cut the tape with his knife. Inside was a single sheet, a photocopy, and it took him a moment to understand what he was looking at because it was so ordinary. A ledger page, ruled columns, an internal accounting document from Ardent Maritime Group dated the 4th of November, 2009, and the header across the top said Disbursement Special Account, 4 authorized D prime, 6 lines, 6 names, 6 amounts. Rourke read them down. A Navy Medical Records Administrator, $1,200,000. A contracting officer, $900,000. A civilian program director at a shipyard, $1.1 million. And the 4th line, Ashcroft S. MCPO, $3,000. Rourke stopped breathing. He read it again. He read the whole page again, top to bottom, looking for the thing that would make it mean something else, some column heading he'd misread. Some reason a man's name would be on a disbursement sheet without him having taken anything. There wasn't one. $3 million, paid to Silas Ashcroft, 8 months after 14 men came out of that hold. And under the 6 lines in the old man's own handwriting, the same block capitals as the envelope pressed hard enough to emboss the paper, 4 words. I took it all. Rourke put the page down on the floor very carefully like it might go off. Then he stood up and walked out of the house and across the headland in the dark until he ran out of ground. And he stood there at the edge with the water going below him, and he put both hands on the back of his neck, and he couldn't get air. Every photograph in that shoebox, every board he'd carried up this hill at 22. The one man in 19 years who had told him something true enough to keep. Most men don't fail because they can't. They fail because they start negotiating with themselves about whether they should, and he had said that in this house which he had bought with it. Rourke heard a sound and realized it had come out of him. Jack was against his leg. He hadn't heard the dog come. "He took it," Rourke said out loud, and his voice was wrecked. "He took the money, Jack. 9 of them are dead, and he took the money." The dog leaned into him harder. Rourke stood out there for a long time, and somewhere in the second hour, standing at the edge of a cliff at 4:30 in the morning, with everything he'd built about that man collapsed under him, the operator in him woke up and asked a question the grieving part hadn't gotten to yet. Then why did he keep the sheet? A man who takes a bribe burns the paper. That is the entire reason the paper is dangerous. Ardent Maritime Group would not have handed a disbursement ledger to the men they were paying. They'd have shown it to nobody, filed it nowhere, kept it in a vault in Portland. Silas Ashcroft had a photocopy, which meant he had stood in a room where that page existed, and he had gotten a copy of it out. Rourke turned around and looked back at the house, at the black shape of it against a sky that was just starting to go gray. $50,000 in bearer bonds, 14 years of coupons, everyone still attached. $3 million paid in 2009 to a man who lived and died in a condemned building with a hole in the roof, driving a 19-year-old truck, buying a newspaper he could have gotten free. Rourke walked back across the headland with the wind at his back and the dog beside him, and he went in through the front door and down the hallway past the broken brick, and he stopped at the top of a stone stair with a stainless bolted handrail that a 66-year-old man had installed himself, and he listened to the long, slow suck and release of water moving somewhere far below the floor. He had spent 11 days trying to work out why a dead man had left him a house. He'd had it backward the whole time. Silas Ashcroft hadn't left him a house. He'd left him a balance sheet, and the only way to find out which side of it the old man had actually died on was to go down. What he had understood sitting in the back of that room was this: $18 million underground was not evidence. It was potential evidence. It only became real at the moment somebody with authority looked at a serial number and wrote it down, and Curtis Vane had spent 6 years making sure nobody with authority ever would. So the job wasn't protecting it. The job was making it impossible to bury quietly. He worked out of the front room that night with the tide table, a legal pad, and 41 hours, and the first thing he did was the thing every instinct he had screamed against. He stopped trying to keep the secret. A secret held by one man dies with him. Silas Ashcroft had proved that. He split it into 3. At 6 in the morning, he was on Margot Teague's step before she'd unlocked, and when she opened the door, he handed her a sheet of paper with 140 lines on it. Refinery stamps, bar serials, bond certificate, numbers transcribed by, handoff 18 open cases by headlamp, between midnight and 4. "I can't print serial numbers," Margot said. "Nobody reads serial numbers. I don't need anybody to read them. I need them to exist in a dated publication before Friday." He put a second page on top. "That's the disbursement sheet. 6 names, 6 amounts, 1 authorizing signature. Ashcroft's on it. You print his name with the rest of them." Margot's hand stopped. "You want me to print that Silas took $3 million. I want you to print it bigger than the others." She looked up at him, and whatever she saw made her sit down. "They'll sue this paper into the ground," she said. "I'll lose the building. I'm 63. "Yeah, that's it, yeah. You've had that box for 14 years, Rourke said. "You already know what it costs to keep it. I'm just telling you what the other one costs." Margot Teague put both hands flat on the desk the way she'd done the first morning, steadying it. 4 pages, she said. "I haven't run 4 pages since 2004. She reached for the phone. "Get out of my office." The second copy went into a padded envelope addressed to a staff investigator on a Senate committee whose name none had given him at 11 the night before, overnighted from the post office at 8:15 with a return receipt, and Rourke stood at that counter and watched the clerk stamp it and felt like he'd fired a flare into fog. The third copy, the tapes, the original ledger page, the photograph. Josie's notebook scanned page by page on Margot's flatbed and burned to a disk was the one that mattered, and that was the one he made the mistake with. He drove 90 minutes to the NCIS resident agency and gave it to a duty agent and filled out a 2-page intake form with his name, the property address, and a summary of what he was alleging, and the agent was polite and thorough and asked good questions and told him it would be assigned within 72 hours. Rourke got back to Harrow Bay at 4 in the afternoon, and Nunn was waiting on his porch with her phone in her hand and her face gray. I made a call to a friend at the regional office, she said, just to see who'd catch it. And special agent in charge for that field office retired from NCIS in 2016. She held the phone up. He's been director of corporate investigations at Ardent Maritime Group since March of 2017. Rourke didn't move. Everything on that form, Nunn said. Your name, what you have, where it is, what time you're there. How long? He'd have had it inside of 2 hours. Rourke turned and looked down the grade at the road, and it was already getting dark, and he thought about a man with clean shoes saying, I've had the right house for 6 years, and he understood that he hadn't reported a crime. He had filed a targeting package on himself. How long until they move? Nunn said. Tonight. He was already going inside. Low slacks at 10:40. If it were me, I'd come at 11. They came at 11:20, and there were 6 of them, and they didn't come up the grade. He heard it the same way he'd heard it before through the dog. Jack came up off the floor and crossed to the mouth of the hallway and stood with his weight forward and his hip trembling under him, and Rourke was on his feet with the pry bar in his hand and the pack already on his back. Not from the road, from the water. They'd put a boat into the sea cave on the slack and come up through the bottom, which meant they had known that stair existed for years and had a plan on a shelf waiting for a night exactly like this one. He had one advantage, and it was not strength. It was a tide table. The chamber and the cave shared air. The flood turned at 11:40, and after that, the cave began throwing water up that stair, and any man in the lower third of it after midnight was going to be swimming in the dark in a concrete box. Vane's people knew that too, which was exactly why they'd given themselves a window and why they'd be moving fast and why they would not want to fight. Rourke went down to the turn 38 steps and put himself at the last landing where the stones squared into concrete because the passage there was 4 feet wide and one man could hold it and there was no way around. Jack came down behind him. He shouldn't have. His hip wouldn't take stairs. He came anyway, and he set himself at Rourke's left knee and faced the dark. The first light came around the bottom turn at 11:31. Federal contractor, security, a voice called up. We're executing a recovery under lawful order. Step aside. Show me the order. Step aside, Mr. Rourke. That's not a no, that's a stall. There's no order. Rourke's voice came back off of the walls hard. You've got 22 minutes before that cave floods this stair, and you're going to spend 9 of them talking to me. Come up or go home. They came up. The first man through was big and moved well and came in low with a collapsible baton, and he was expecting a 45-year-old man in a stairwell. What he got was a pry bar taken on the flat of the wrist hard, and the baton went clattering down the steps behind him, and then Rourke had him against the wall by the vest and put a knee up into the meat of his thigh and dumped him down 4 risers into the second man. Both of them went into the water at the bottom. Back, Rourke shouted at Jack, and the dog did not go back. The third came over the top of them and got a hand on Rourke's collar, and the 2 of them went down together on the landing, and Rourke felt his torn shoulder let go completely. And he stopped being an operator for a second and became a man in a lot of pain in the dark. Jack hit the guy at the shoulder, not the throat, not the arm, the old training, the shoulder, the mass, the shove, and 100 pounds of shepherd, off a landing 4 feet wide, put a 200-pound man into the wall, and Rourke got out from under him and got his forearm across the back of his neck and held him there until he stopped fighting. The fourth man kicked the dog. It was a boot into the ribs hard enough that Rourke heard it over everything else, and Jack made a sound Rourke had heard exactly once in 8 years and did not go down. He did not go down. He set his feet in 4 inches of rising water and with 2 ribs broken, and put himself back across the passage, and he did not move for the next 6 minutes. Rourke went a little bit out of himself then. I took the 4th man off the wall with the pry bar across the forearm and put him into the rail and let him fall, and the fifth one saw all of it from the turn and stopped coming. 12 minutes, Rourke shouted down the stair. He was bleeding from somewhere on his scalp and couldn't lift his right arm above his ribs. You want to drown for a man who's going to fire you by email, 12 minutes. The water was over the bottom step. Somebody down there said something. Somebody else answered. At 11:51, they went out dragging two of their own moving fast, and the last one out looked up the stair once, and Rourke saw his face. And he was maybe 26 years old, and he looked terrified. Rourke sat down on the landing. The water came up 9 more steps and stopped, and he sat there and got his good arm around his dog and felt the ribs move under his hand, and Jack was panting, shallow and fast, and pushed his head into Rourke's chest and stayed. "You don't do that," Rourke said. His voice wasn't working. "You don't ever do that again." He carried him up 38 steps. The vet abandoned kept him 90 minutes and came out and said 2 ribs, no flail segment, no puncture, and that the hip was aggravated and that the dog needed 6 weeks off it. Rourke said, "Thank you." The vet looked at his shoulder and his scalp and said, "Sir, you need to be seen," and Rourke said, "Thank you" again, and paid in cash and got Jack into the truck and drove back to Harrow Bay in the dark with the dog's head on his thigh and got there at 5:40 in the morning, which was 2 hours and 20 minutes before they brought the equipment up. The excavator came up the grade on a lowboy at 8, and behind it were 2 dump trucks and a pickup with the county building official in it and Sheriff Doty's cruiser bringing up the rear. And behind them in a line down the county road, 40 or 50 vehicles that had no business being there. Margot Teague's 4-page edition had gone out Friday morning to 211 subscribers and been photographed and forwarded and posted, and by 8 o'clock on Saturday there were people on that road who had driven from Coos Bay and Astoria, and one man from Bremerton who had served on a salvage crew in 1998 and would not say why he'd come. Doty got out first. He came up the porch steps with the paper in his hand, and he looked like he hadn't slept. "You know I have to serve this," he said. "I know. I've got no discretion. It's a county order, and I'm the county's officer." "Wallace," Rourke looked at him, "I'm not going to make you the villain of this. You've been carrying enough." Doty's jaw worked. He handed him the order. "You've got 30 minutes to remove personal property," he said, and his voice was not steady, "and then they're going to start on the east side." Rourke folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he stepped down off the porch and walked out in front of the excavator, and he stood there in a faded green digital camouflage uniform with his right arm hanging wrong and a dog that couldn't stand lying on the top step behind him, and he took the photograph out of his jacket. He didn't shout. He thought about shouting and decided against it. He just started reading. "Daniel Kerrigan," he said. The operator in the cab didn't move. "Dale Pike." Something happened in the crowd at the bottom of the grade. A shift. Anthony Baird, Michael Sosa, Raymond Wills. And out of the line of people on the road, Marlon Pike came walking up the grade with his hat already in his hand, and he got about halfway and stopped and said loud enough to carry, "Dale Pike was my brother. He was 34. Rourke kept going. "Curtis Oyalaran, Stephen Vasquez." A woman's voice from the road. "Stephen Vasquez was my husband." Joseph Ranney. "That's my dad," a man called out, and his voice broke on it. "Marcus Delaney." Nobody answered for Delaney. Rourke waited 3 seconds and then said, "Marcus Delaney had nobody left to come, and that landed on that hillside harder than any of the ones that did. He'd gotten to 9, and that was when the excavator shut down. It didn't power off dramatically. The operator just reached over and killed it, and the noise stopped, and in the silence you could hear the wind and 100 people breathing. The kid climbed down out of the cab. He was maybe 30. He walked over to the county official and said something Rourke couldn't hear. And the official said something back sharp, and the kid said clearly, "Then you get in it." He walked down the grade past all of them and got in his truck and left. The county official stood there with a clipboard and nobody to run his machine and 100 people watching him, and after a minute he got on his phone and turned his back. And Jack, who could not stand, who had been carried up 38 steps 8 hours earlier, got himself up off that porch step one leg at a time and limped down and lay down flat across the bottom of the grade in front of the tracks. Nobody made him do it. He just went and lay down where the machine would have to come, the way he'd stood in a hallway for 4 days and in a stairwell for 6 minutes and put his head on his paws. Somebody in the crowd started crying. Rourke stood there with the photograph in his hand and couldn't say the 14th name. The abatement was suspended at 2:40 that afternoon by a county commissioner who had spent the morning being called by 200 people and one Senate staffer, and the phrase used in the suspension was pending review of preservation interest, which meant nothing legally and everything practically, and it bought 11 days. Curtis Vane came on the 9th of them. He came alone in the middle of the afternoon, and he parked at the bottom and walked up, and he did not stop at the gate this time. He came all the way to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps with his hands in his coat pockets. Jack lifted his head and growled, and Rourke put a hand on him and the growl stopped. "Your dog's hurt," Vane said. "Your man kicked him." "He's not my man. He's a subcontractor who has since been terminated for exceeding scope." Vane said it without a flicker. "I'm aware of how that sounds. Say what you came to say." Vane took his right hand out of his pocket, and there was a folded document in it. He held it out. Rourke didn't take it. "That's an internal memorandum dated the 28th of February 2009, Vane said. "It's a risk assessment on the Meridian Vale cargo manifest. It concludes that the declared contents do not match the bill of lading, that the drums are likely compromised, and that disclosure prior to the salvage award would result in forfeiture of the contract." He let it sit there in the air between them. "It's initialed in 3 places," he said. "All 3 are mine." Rourke took it. He read it twice, and it was worse than everything else he had, because everything else was money and paper and after the fact. And this was 11 days before 14 men got in the water, and it said, "likely compromised," and it was signed by a man standing 4 feet from him. "Why," Rourke said, "you'll want a reason you can use." Vane's voice didn't change. "Here's the actual one. Douglas Prine is 68, and he's leaving in March, regardless with a pension the board cannot touch. I'm 50. If this lands with no name on it, the corporation absorbs it, and the process eats whoever is nearest, and the nearest man in 11 years will be me." He nodded at the paper. "That memorandum has my initials on it and a distribution list with his name at the top. It is the only document in existence that proves I escalated it and he received it. You're not confessing, you're trading up." "Yes. 9 men are dead and you're managing a career." "I'm 48 hours from being the only person available to blame," Vane said, "and I have been rational about this every single day since 2009, and I'd rather you understand that than think I've had some kind of change of heart, because if you build a case on the theory that I feel bad, you'll lose." Rourke looked at him for a long moment. "You knew," he said, "in February, before any of them got on the boat. I wrote it down. That's what that page is. You knew, and you wrote a memo, and then you went home." Something moved behind Vane's face for the first time in 3 weeks, a fraction. Nothing more the way a man's expression changes when a door he has kept shut gets bumped from the other side. "Yes," he said. Then he put his hands back in his pockets. "Don't mistake this for anything, Senior Chief," he said. "You beat me because you got the town before I did. That's all this is. If Margot Teague had run those pages in 2015 like she should have, we'd have had this conversation 11 years ago, and you'd have never inherited a thing." He went back down the grade. Rourke stood on the porch holding a page that had been sitting in a filing cabinet since 11 days before Danny Kerrigan got into the water, and he thought about a woman with 41 column inches and a sheriff with 211 jobs and an old man with a pencil on the 11th of March, and how not one of them had done a single thing that was on its own unforgivable. The hearing was in Washington in the 2nd week of November, and they flew him out, and he wore the uniform because it was still the most durable clothing he owned, and because by then it meant something else. He testified for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He read the disbursement sheet into the record. He read the 6 names on it, and he did not skip the 4th one, and he did not soften it. Master Chief Petty Officer Silas Ashcroft, $3 million, and he is the reason there are no exposure logs, and he is also the reason I am sitting here, and I want both of those things in the record in that order. He played 11 minutes of a dying man's voice into a Senate hearing room and watched a row of staffers stop taking notes. He entered a memorandum initialed in 3 places on the 28th of February 2009. It was by any measure the most consequential thing he had ever done, and it was not what anyone in that room would remember. Because in the afternoon session they called Josie Kerrigan, 11 years old by then in a coat that fit her, and they lowered the microphone twice and it still wasn't right. So she stood up on the seat of the chair, and she opened a scorched spiral notebook. My dad's name was Daniel Kerrigan, she said. The room went absolutely quiet in the way rooms do when everyone in them realizes at the same instant that they are not going to get to be comfortable. I was a diver in the United States Navy. He went in the water for 9 days in March 2009. He got sick when I was 2. He tried 3 times to get help, and they said no 3 times. She turned a page. Her hands were shaking. She did not stop. This is the first letter. This is the second letter. This is the third letter. She looked up at the row of them. They're the same letter. All 3 of them say the same words, and they were all signed on the same day, September 22nd, 2014. Somebody in the gallery made a sound. My dad kept these for 6 years, she said. He thought he filled it out wrong. He thought it was his fault 3 times. He tried to burn them because it was making him sick to keep reading them, and I took them out of the barrel. She held the notebook up in both hands so they could see the scorch mark on the corner. He didn't do anything wrong, Josie Kerrigan said. Somebody just typed it once and sent it to everybody. And in the second row of the gallery, Ethan Rourke put his hand over his eyes, and behind the barrier at the back of the room, a German shepherd with a rebuilt hip and 2 healed ribs lay flat on the carpet with his head on his paws and his harness plate turned up to the light, and neither of them made a sound. The settlement came in April, and Rourke read the announcement standing in Margot Teague's office with the phone still in his hand, and the number was $340 million. He read the second paragraph and put the phone down on the desk. Ardent Maritime Group had agreed to establish a compensation fund for personnel involved in 9 salvage contracts between 1996 and 2011. The agreement resolved all pending and future claims, and in the fourth line in language that had been negotiated by people who were paid a great deal of money to negotiate exactly that line, it said the settlement was entered without admission of liability, causation, or wrongdoing of any kind. Margot read it over his shoulder and said nothing for a while. $340 million, she said finally, and nobody did anything wrong. That's the whole trick, Rourke's voice was flat. They'll pay any amount of money. What they won't do is say a sentence. Then what did we get? Money for the living, nothing for the dead. He sat down on the corner of her desk because his shoulder had never healed right, and standing for long periods had become a decision instead of a default. You know what it means legally, he said. It means if a diver gets a diagnosis in 2031, he starts over. There's no finding for him to point at. There's no precedent. He'll get a letter that says no documented exposure event, and he'll think he filled it out wrong, and he'll try 3 times. Margot took her glasses off. Then say that in public, she said. I'm going to. No, say it now while there are still cameras. I did. There were 4 of them in Harrow Bay that week, and he stood in front of all of them in the parking lot of the cannery and said in about 90 seconds that a settlement without a finding was a company buying the right to do it again, and that the family should take every dollar because they had earned it and because taking it changed nothing, and that anyone who called this justice had not read the 4th line. It ran for 2 days. Then a hurricane made landfall in Florida, and it stopped running. That was the part nobody warned him about. Not the fight, but the way the world simply moved on to the next thing while you were still standing in the same parking lot. The criminal referrals went out in June. Nunn called him at 7 in the morning to tell him, and she did not sound like a woman delivering good news. 1 indictment, she said. Rourke waited. Loretta Pike, 59. She was a GS7 records administrator at the Regional Benefits Office in 2014. He had to sit down. Say that again. She's charged with falsification of federal records, 11 counts. They're alleging she authored and distributed the standard denial language and applied it to consolidated claims. She typed it. She typed it. None, she was a GS7. She made about $51,000 a year. Somebody handed her a stack and a paragraph. I know. Is she related to Marlon? There was a pause on the line. Cousin, Nunn said. By marriage. Dale Pike was her nephew. Rourke put his hand over his eyes. The woman who had typed the paragraph that denied a claim to her own husband's cousin's son. Because somebody above her had said, process these together, and she had not asked, and now she was the only human being in the United States of America facing a courtroom over the deaths of 9 men. What about the disbursement sheet, he said, 6 names. Two are dead, one's incompetent. One entered a deferred prosecution agreement with a fine that's less than what he was paid. Nunn's voice had gone hard. Prine's counsel produced a 2009 opinion letter from outside counsel that characterizes the payments as retention consideration. It's garbage, but it's a garbage document from a law firm, which means charging him becomes a 2-year fight over intent, and the office has declined. Vane. Vane's name, Nunn said, does not appear in a single public document, not the settlement, not the referrals, not the committee report. He gave me a memo with his initials on it. He gave you a memo with his initials on it that proves he escalated a concern to a superior, she said. You handed the government the exhibit that makes him a whistleblower. Rourke sat there and let it land. He had beaten Curtis Vane. That was what everyone told him. He had beaten him in a stairwell and beaten him on a grade in front of 100 people and beaten him in a hearing room, and Curtis Vane had walked out of it as a man who raised a red flag in February of 2009 and was overruled. He told me, Rourke said quietly, the day he handed it to me. He told me exactly what he was doing, and I took it anyway because I wanted the 28th of February. You did the right thing. It's why the committee report exists. Yeah, he rubbed his face. And a 59-year-old clerk is going to prison. He drove to Coos Bay in July and sat in a hallway for 40 minutes, waiting for a woman he'd never met to agree to see him. Loretta Pike came out in a cardigan with her arms folded across herself, and she stopped 6 feet away and looked at him. You're him, she said. Yes, ma'am. You want me to say something you can use? No. Then what do you want? Rourke had rehearsed it for 2 hours in the truck, and none of it survived. I want to know who gave you the stack, he said. She laughed, one short exhale, and there was nothing in it at all. Nobody gave me a stack. She shook her head. You don't understand how it works. A supervisor sends an email that says these 11 are related, use consistent language for the file. That's it. That's the whole thing. 11 words. She wiped under her eye with the back of her wrist and did it impatiently, like the crying was an inconvenience. Do you know how many claims I processed in 2014? 2,200. Do you know how many of them I remember? 11. I remember these 11 because a man in Portland wrote please on the bottom of his form. Rourke didn't say anything. Dale was my sister-in-law's boy, Loretta Pike said. I typed his name into the field. And I did not look at what the letter said because I had 2,200 of them, and it was September. That's not... Don't. Her voice came up. Don't you tell me that's not my fault. I've had 2 years to decide, and I decided it is. She got her arms folded again. It's just not only mine, and there's nobody else in the room. He stood in that hallway for another second. I'll say that, he said. Every time anybody puts a microphone in front of me, I'll say that. Say it wherever you want. Loretta Pike turned around. I'm still the one going. She pleaded out in September to 2 counts and got 14 months. The $18 million was seized in March as evidentiary material cataloged over 9 days by 4 federal agents who photographed every bar and every certificate, and Rourke stood in the hallway of his own house and watched them carry it up 38 steps in plastic crates. He'd thought he would feel something. He didn't. It looked like moving day. The forfeiture came through in October because the money had been paid to the 6 men and not by the company to any victim. And because there was no criminal conviction attaching to it, it went into the general fund of the United States Treasury. Not $1 of it reached a single family in Harrow Bay. Nunn told him he had a colorable claim to a finder's portion. She put a number in front of him on a legal pad, and the number had 7 digits in it. Rourke wrote 4 words on the bottom of the page. I declined the claim and signed it and dated it and slid it back. You want to think about that overnight, Nunn said. No. Ethan, you've been living in a truck. That money killed 9 men and it paid a master chief $3 million to sign a form. He stood up. I'm not taking a slice. Nunn looked at the page for a long moment. For the record, she said, I've drafted 400 wills in this town, and that's the single dumbest thing anybody's ever done in this office. Noted. And I'd have done the same. She capped her pen. Sit down. Let's talk about the house. They didn't tear it down. That was the thing Rourke would never entirely believe, even standing in it. The preservation interest suspension expired in January, and the county had every right to reinstate the abatement and instead the commission voted 4-1 to transfer the structure to a nonprofit for $2 contingent on stabilization. And the man who made the motion was the same building official who had inspected it through binoculars. Rourke never asked him why. He shook his hand and let him keep it. They called it Night Glass House. It took 14 months, and it opened with a roof and no east wing and a lot of exposed framing, and what it was functionally was a filing system. That was all. A veteran's exposure records archive a place where a man who had been on a contaminated hull in a burn pit rotation in a hold in a bay could bring what he had and get it scanned, indexed, dated, notarized, and stored in 3 separate places. One of which was a server in Oregon, one of which was a server in Virginia, and one of which was paper in a fire safe in a stairwell that a bootlegger had cut into a cliff in 1931. Margot Teague ran it. She had lost the Ledger Ardens subsidiary, pulled its advertising in June exactly the way she'd said it would, and the paper went under in 11 weeks, and she had put the last 4-page edition in a frame and hung it in the entryway and gone to work in a building with no heat. Everything gets a date and a copy, she'd tell people on the first day every single time, without variation. 2 copies leave this building before you do. If a thing exists in 3 places, no one can decide it never existed. She said it like a prayer, and Rourke understood that it was one, and that she had been composing it for 14 years in a 2-room office with 41 column inches of advertising. Doty resigned in the spring. He didn't announce it. He filed the paperwork and finished out, and on his last day he drove up the grade and sat in his truck for a minute, the way he always had, and then got out and came up the steps and handed Rourke a manila envelope. "What's this?" 1998 through 2009, Doty said. "Every noise complaint, every welfare check, every call I ever took out to that headland, and everything I ever wrote about a cannery that wasn't in a report." Rourke looked at him. "You had this the whole time?" "I had it in my own house in a box." Doty's hands were in his pockets. "You asked me one time to say one true thing out loud in public. I've been sitting with that for 2 years. Wallace, I want to say the thing." He held up a hand. "I want to say it while nobody's filming it because I don't want credit and I don't want to be forgiven. I just want it said to somebody who'll remember it. I knew in 2011, a man from that company took me to lunch in Coos Bay and told me the cannery purchase came with an expectation of, and I quote him exactly, a stable community environment." He nodded slowly. "I ate the lunch, I drove home, and for 13 years I told myself I hadn't been offered anything because he never handed me $1. He didn't have to." "No," Doty said, "he didn't. That's what I've been sitting with." He looked out at the water. 211 jobs, he said. "That's what I said to you, and they closed the line anyway in November and moved it to Astoria, and now there's 140 of them, and 9 men are still dead, and I got exactly nothing for all of it." He shook his head once. "You should put that in the file. That's the true thing. Nobody who kept quiet in this town got to keep what they kept quiet for." He shook Rourke's hand and drove down the grade, and Rourke never saw him again, and the envelope went into the archive with a date and a copy and a copy. Marlon Pike came in October with a plywood sign he'd cut and routed himself and set it against the porch and stood there with his hat in his hands the way he'd stood on the grade. "I laughed at you on the pier," he said. "You did. I want to say I'm sorry." "Marlon, no, I want to say what I'm sorry for because the other kind's cheap." Pike's jaw was working. "I'm not sorry I made a joke. I'm sorry that when you got off that boat, I already knew about Dale, and I made a joke anyway because that's what we all did here. We turned it into weather, something that happened, something you don't talk about." He looked down at the sign. "My brother was 34, and I made a joke about the man who came to dig him up." Rourke put a hand on his shoulder and left it there for a second. "You stood up at the funeral," he said. "You were first." "That was after." "Everything anybody does is after," Rourke said. "That's the only place we get to stand." Josie Kerrigan turned 12 in February. She came up to Night Glass House on Saturdays and did her homework at a table in the front room, and Margot paid her $9 an hour to index and taught her to run the scanner, and she was better at it than either of them within a month. And on the 12th of March at 8 in the morning, in a building with no heat and a partial roof, she stood on a chair because the podium was too tall and read 14 names out loud. Not 9, 14. That had been her idea, and she had not asked anyone's permission. The 9 who were dead and the 5 who were living, and she read them in the order they appeared on the roster of 12 MAR 2009. And after the 14th, she said the thing she said every year, which she had also written herself. They were in the water for 9 days. It's in the record now. It can't come out. There were about 30 people in the room the first year. There were about 90 the second. Isire. The dog was 11 that spring. Jack's ribs had knitted clean, and the hip had never come back all the way, and he had developed a rolling limp that got worse in the cold and better in the afternoon, and he could no longer do the 38 steps at all. So work had put a bed for him at the top of the stair, and that was where he lived. He still wore the harness. Rourke had asked the vet whether it bothered him, and the vet had said not at the weight it is now, and so it stayed on tan gold and black under black nylon. The plate on the left side with K9 Jack stitched in white thread going gray from handling, because everybody who came into that building put a hand on it. That had started by accident and become a thing. Men came in with a bot of paper and 30 years of being told nothing had happened to them, and they stopped at the top of the stair, and they crouched down and put a hand on a dog's shoulder before they went in and told a stranger their story. Rourke never asked them why either. I went in for the scan in May because Margot made the appointment herself and then drove him to it. He had told himself for 2 years that the shortness of breath was the shoulder, and then that it was the shoulder and the cold, and then he stopped telling himself anything and just didn't schedule it, which is a decision that men make, and call not making one. The radiologist was young and careful with his words and put the images up and used the phrase early interstitial changes. And then, because Rourke asked him directly and did not let him leave the sentence unfinished, said that the pattern was consistent with prior inhalational or dermal exposure to certain industrial compounds, and that he'd want a pulmonologist and a full occupational history. I was never in the hold, Rourke said. You said you spent 14 months in a building over a sea cave with standing water in it. Rourke looked at the screen. Silas Ashcroft had stored $18 million in a flooded chamber and lived above it for 4 years and died at 71 of something. The death certificate called a lung condition, and Rourke had gone down that stair 11 times and slept 2 floors above it for 412 nights. He didn't say any of that. He thanked the man and got his jacket. Margot was in the waiting room, and she stood up when she saw his face, and he said, "It's fine." And she said, "Ethan." And he said, "It's fine, Margot." And she let him have it because she'd known him 2 years and knew when he needed it. He didn't tell her that week. He didn't tell Nunn. He didn't tell Josie, and that was the one that cost. What he did was drive home and sit on the porch with his hand on his dog and go through it the way he went through everything, which was slowly and out loud with nobody to hear it but a shepherd who couldn't do stairs. Here's the thing, he told him. If I go up there and make a speech about it, it's a story. Guy who exposed it turns out to have it. That runs for a week. Jack's tail moved once on the boards. And then what? Rourke rubbed his eyes. Then it's about me. He sat there a long time. That's not what he built the room for, he said. On a Tuesday in June, he drove to the regional benefits office in Portland, and he did not call ahead, and he did not tell anybody in Washington, and he took a number from a machine at the door. The number was 214. He sat down in a plastic chair between a man in his 70s with an oxygen cannula and a woman about 35 in a National Guard sweatshirt with a folder in her lap, and he waited an hour and 40 minutes. Somewhere in the second hour, the man beside him looked over at the faded green digital camouflage and said, "Where'd you serve all over?" "Yeah." The man laughed a little, and it cost him. "They ask you for the incident report." "They will." "There's never an incident report," the man said. "That's the whole game. 22 years and there's never an incident report." Rourke turned his head and looked at him. "There's a place on the coast," he said. "Harrow Bay. It's an archive. You bring whatever you've got. They scan it, they date it, they notarize it, and 2 copies leave the building before you do." "That work?" "It works when you file." "You've been—" "Yeah," Rourke said. "I've been." And then they called 214, and he got up and he walked to the window with his folder under his arm, a scan report, a service record, and occupational history he had written out longhand at his own kitchen table, and he sat down across from a clerk who was maybe 26 years old and looked tired at 10 in the morning. "Name of Rourke, Ethan, Senior Chief Retired." "What are we filing today?" He put the folder on the counter and slid it under the glass. "Exposure claim," he said. "First time. The kid opened it and started typing and did not look up and had no idea who he was. And that was exactly right. That was the entire point, that a man could walk in off the street with a folder and be nobody and get a number and have it entered. Rourke sat there while the keys clicked and thought about a pencil on the 11th of March 2009 and a line struck through and a name left in, and how for 16 years he had believed he was the man who got out. He wasn't. He was line 15. He had always been line 15. It had just taken the paper a long time to catch up. The clerk printed the receipt, stamped it, and slid it back under the glass. "Keep that," he said. "That's your date of claim." "I know," Rourke said. "I'll make a copy." He got home at 6. Josie was on the porch with her backpack waiting because it was Tuesday and she'd figured out where he'd gone the way she figured out everything, which was by paying attention to adults who thought she wasn't. She stood up when the truck door shut. "You went to Portland," she said. "I did. At door? For you or for somebody else?" Rourke stopped at the bottom of the steps. He'd had 4 weeks to build an answer, and he'd built 11 of them, and standing there looking at a 12-year-old who had read 3 denial letters into a Senate microphone, he understood that every single one of them was a version of what her father had been told. "For me," he said, "Josie's face did something, and she got it under control fast, and that was worse than if she hadn't. Is it the same as my dad's?" "It's early. It's not the same yet." He came up one step. "Josie, I'm going to tell you the true thing, and then I'm going to tell you the other true thing, and you have to take both." She nodded. "The first one is that I'm sick, and I've filed, and I don't know how it goes." "Okay." "The second one is that it took your dad 6 years and 3 letters, and he never got a date of claim that anybody honored." He held up the receipt. "I got one this morning in 90 minutes from a kid who didn't know my name. And the reason that happened is not because I'm special. It's because there's a room on this hill with 2,000 files in it now, and everybody in that office knows it exists." She took the receipt out of his hand and looked at it. "There's only one copy," she said. Rourke almost laughed. "Yeah," he said, "there is." Josie Kerrigan put it in her backpack, zipped it, and looked up at him with the flat competence of somebody who had been indexing records for $9 an hour since she was 11. "I'll scan it Saturday," she said. "You'll have 3 by Monday." He lived 7 more years. That's a longer time than the radiologist would have committed to, and a shorter one than Margot prayed for. And he spent most of it in a building with a partial roof teaching men in their 50s how to put a date on a piece of paper. Jack made it 2 of them and died in the fall at the top of a stair. He could no longer descend with his head on Rourke's knee and his harness on, and Rourke buried him on the headland 40 feet from the edge and did not mark it because he said the dog had never once needed a sign to know where he was supposed to be standing. Night Glass House holds 19,000 files now. It has a roof and an east wing and heat, and Josie Kerrigan runs it, and she is 31 years old, and she still says Margot's line to every man who walks in word for word without variation. The company never admitted anything. Douglas Prine died in his own bed at 81 with his pension intact, and 2 board seats, and an obituary that called him a distinguished naval officer and philanthropist. Curtis Vane became general counsel of a firm in Seattle. Loretta Pike served 11 months of 14 and worked the rest of her life at a hardware store in Coos Bay, and there are people in Harrow Bay who still won't speak to her, and Josie reads her nephew's name out loud on the 12th of March every year and always has. The truth never brought a single one of those 14 men home, and it never made anyone with power say the sentence out loud, but it put their 9 days in the water into a record that 3 separate buildings now hold dated and copied and beyond anyone's reach, so that no clerk, no company, and no country will ever again be able to write down that nothing happened to them.